So welcome everybody to Mission Planning for Corona Resilience. It's great to have you with us. This is our last webinar for the time being, last one for this connectional year. But we are planning future webinars. So we've been asking already, fear not, there will be further opportunities to meet like this. But we're going to take a break over August. I'm delighted to have a panel with me today who are mostly folks from the Durham and Deerness Valley circuits in the Darlington Methodist District. We also have Helle Sewell, who is the mission enabler for the Darlington District, and she's been working with the Durham circuit. And Fidge is going to join us a little bit later. Fiona Fidgin, who is a learning network officer, she's going to be offering us some thoughts a bit later on too. So welcome to everyone from the Durham circuit. John Squares is the superintendent. John, if you unmute yourself, I'd love to start by just asking you to explain to everyone here, what was it you were planning to do in the circuit before lockdown hit?
World domination, really. We were trying to figure out how to live up to a directive that our district chair made when he newly arrived in our region. He suggested that within the district, every church could be growing within 10 years. And in our circuit, we took on to that challenge quite seriously and thought a circuit review might help us identify gaps that we could fill with ministries that would help us to grow, and identify two things maybe that we could let go of that are no longer fit for purpose. We have some really talented folks. Helle has come to us in the middle of the process and has been a godsend. Wonderful minds who've been around the circuit for years and decades that know our history and know the passion for the way forward. And, you know, this great learning network that was willing to come in and help us. And then, Emma, we met you too, and put together a great team to challenge us to ask the right questions. And the plan was to try and expose those gaps and opportunities and figure out an action plan for making changes in the circuit so that we would be the first circuit that could show that every church was growing. Not that I'm competitive.
Well, a little competition sometimes a good thing. John, there were all sorts of practical plans, weren't there? There was a musical that was made. Tell us about the musical, because I was intrigued by that.
Yeah, so we're in Durham. I'm in the city center. So we've got a lot of students, not a ton, but a lot of students who have affection for the Methodist Church, and one of them has become a local preacher. And in his final project in trying to gain the status of local preacher, he produced a musical that was projecting what the Methodist Church might look like in 50 years. And it asked a lot of the questions that we were exploring in review, projecting what would happen if we made wrong decisions and suggesting other ways forward if we made right decisions. So it was a great way, fun way to explore what the potential of our church might be. And so that was one of the things we were doing in advance. And Helle got together and helped put together a great Bible study that would have been had a video component to it that would have drawn the circuit together in preparation for looking and exploring the type of answers to the questions we would be asking. So there was a fair amount of prep work that went into even the launch of a review.
Right, but then lockdown hits. So you planned this Lent Bible study, and then we all had to stay at home throughout the second half of Lent. So I'm guessing that kind of ground to a halt, did it?
Well, I mean, the plans as they were laid out ground to a halt, but fortunately you and Helle, Ruth, the Fidge, the nucleus of this team that were constructing the review started asking questions about, well, you know what question should we be asking in this context? Because we're in a completely new way of being, and it's unprecedented. So the idea of the review has moved from this fixed event to something that is a part of our culture now, as we're trying to figure out how we reform coming out of lockdown. So things ground to a halt, but only for a very little while, because each of you kept bugging me.
Excellent. Well, it was great fun, and still is great fun bugging you, John, as you put it. We're going to hear a little bit more about your process, your review process, and about your plans for the future in a little bit. And we're going to hear from some of your colleagues in the circuit as well. But for now, I'm just going to introduce to everyone listening an 8-step mission planning process. So I've been part of the connectional team for just over a year now. And one of my roles in the evangelism and growth team is to come up with a mission planning strategy for the UK. So building on the excellent work that's already being done, the work of the Learning Network, of the district mission and community, the great mission planning work that's happening in churches and circuits, and trying to build capacity, trying to bring people together who are doing great work. And during lockdown and just before, I've developed this process and found this is something that I thought could be of help, particularly in the situation we're in now. So I'm going to share my screen now and just introduce. No, that's not going to work. I'm going to share my screen and show a simple graphic. I need to open the document before I can share it. There we go, folks. Hopefully you will see this shortly. So here you can see an 8-step process for mission planning, and this is a simple diagram that I put together. So some of this will be really obvious to many of you listening. Some of it may be new. The idea is that this is kind of a shared understanding of mission planning that includes the sorts of things that we feel make up a great mission plan. So step 1, decide on a process. In other words, how are we going to write this mission plan? Mission planning needs to flow out of a conversation between lots of people, church members, people in the wider circuit, if you're writing a circuit mission plan. So you'll need a series of conversations. And so deciding on a process means, how are we going to do this? How much time are we going to take? When are we going to meet with people? And drawing in people from the wider community is really important as well. So putting those dates for those conversations in the diary early on. Step 2, do a community audit. This is something that the Church of England has been promoting as part of mission action planning for some years now. And so all we mean by this is getting to know our communities really well, really deeply, getting a feel for who lives near our church or in our circuit. What are the things that keep them up at night? What are the things that bring them joy? What's the ethnic makeup of our community? Are there people of other faiths? How wealthy or how poor is our community, and so on. So community audits, getting a sense of the needs of our community, is absolutely crucial. And then step 3 is probably going to be quite a familiar one. Conduct a church review, or in the case of Durham and Deerness, a circuit review. And this is something that I know many Methodist churches and circuits are good at already. So looking at what we're doing, what's been going well, what hasn't been going well, what do we have available to us? How much staff time, ministerial time do we have? How much money do we have available? Dreaming together is presented as separate from reviewing, because it's emphasising there that as well as reviewing what we have done in the past, it's important to dream about the future, to consider possibilities that might be new. And dream together, because we want to hear lots of people's dreams and get a feel for what God might be saying to us through each other. Step 5, I feel particularly important as we come out of lockdown and seek to recover from the effects of coronavirus. Choose priorities. So in other words, we may well have less money, we may well have less volunteer time. Many people will quite rightly, quite understandably, be either shielding or staying at home out of safety reasons. And so we'll need to be really clear about prioritising the most important things to do, because we'll have fewer resources with which to do them. And so writing a great mission plan involves figuring out what are the priorities, what are the things God would have us focus on this year or in the next 18 months. Step 6 is a pretty straightforward one: identify actions. In other words, this is our plan. What are we going to do about it? What things will we do this year? Who's going to do them? And when are they going to do them by? And this helps to ensure that all the work isn't dumped on one person, but that we have got names against actions. It makes accountability much easier and makes it much more likely that things will get done. Step 7, consider the fruit. What would fruitfulness look like from the activities we have planned? How will we know that we're beginning to see transformation happen as a result of what we've been doing? Recognizing that not everything will be fruitful straight away, but long term, we would hope to see fruit from our activities. And perhaps in the future, activities that aren't fruitful will need to be set aside to make space for others that may be more fruitful. And then finally, step 8, set a date for a review. A living mission plan, a mission plan that's really useful, has to be something that we come back to again and again, not just something we work on once and then put in a folder somewhere and never think about again. So that's just a brief overview of this 8-step mission planning process. And that is going to be made available on the new Evangelism and Growth web pages from the 1st of August, along with other associated resources. And you'll hear a bit more about that later on. So we're now going to come back to the circuit team and have a conversation and learn a little bit more about the circuit review process and discuss it in the light of that 8-step process. So we have John Squares with us, the superintendent. We also have Ruth Lackenby, another minister in the circuits. We have Helle Sewell, the Darlington mission enabler. And I believe that we have Fidge joining us a little bit later on. So we'll introduce her to you a little bit later. Do we have, we may possibly have others from the circuit join in along, we're expecting a couple of folks from your circuit team to pitch in. So this 8-step mission planning process, what would following this process mean for Durham and Deerness Valley, I wonder? Now, I started with step 1, design a process, but you actually started a bit further back, didn't you, with preparation for this process, which was a wonderful idea. I thought the Bible study that was planned to prepare people. I mean, what has lockdown meant for that? Is that something that you're still going to be doing? How might that happen?
I'm happy to speak into any question,
Please.
but I'm a little nervous to dominate things because people have been around a lot longer than I have, like Penny, who is our circuit steward, who's here, and we'll talk to a few of the questions, might have a perspective. We have other members of the circuit who haven't been as involved in the planning. But with the, I think what we've discovered is we already had the play, we had the musical, that was good fun. We were imagining a package that could be could happen in a system and in an organized structure of steps, not unlike what you've shared with us. And when you shared with us your 8-step process, we thought it had great value in our planning. But I think what we've discovered in lockdown is that it's kind of like throwing up a deck of cards and they're all coming down in different places. There are different things that are meeting us in this moment, which might be likely redefined in a few weeks' time when the guidelines change. So we are imagining the process to be really quite fluid, and for us to engage in the different aspects of what we were doing and planning is going to happen in a creative way. The circuit is reforming and then reviewing its reform along the way at each step, trying to add new things to its mission plan. And I trust that the group that's helped us come to a point of circuit review is going to be working alongside us, because they've been working alongside us in this lockdown period, challenging us to think about things and look at them in a new way. And it's been tremendously helpful.
That's great. So step 1 in the process that I've presented is that design a process. In other words, figure out how these conversations are going to happen. How are you going to have these conversations in Durham and Deerness Valley? Bearing in mind, I'm guessing a lot of your church members are not going to be able to want to come. They're not going to want to come to in-person meetings. It's not going to be safe. How are you going to have conversations as we very slowly come out of lockdown?
All right. So I'm going to just be bold and keep talking. I'm sorry. Anyone interrupt me, please interrupt me. We have accepted a process that is reacting to the situation that we're in that requires a little more guidance from our circuit meeting than maybe we would have wanted. We would have rather things grown up before decisions were needing to be made at a circuit meeting. But we're imagining coming out of lockdown with some of the challenges that you quite accurately described in the beginning about shortages in finance and the difference in the number of people who feel comfortable coming out and helping us to gather. That we recognize there needs to be an ethos and a priority of coming together to support one another, and that together we're going to see our ways through this. That is about to happen. We're about to have this meeting to talk about what a new kind of togetherness would look like. So we are genuinely reforming the circuit if the circuit meeting agrees to the principles. That was driven by the preparation process for doing this community review and looking at the way in which we'd assessed what was going on in our different communities, different villages, different places where churches have holdings. Looking at the properties themselves, we had a certain amount of information, and we had a history of reviews having been done previously through the generations that actually some people complained of. They've said, we keep having these reviews and nothing comes from it. We had all of that information, and what we have now is a desire to structure it in a way that will help us to come out of lockdown, and then from that position, continue to add to a blank page what our actions are going to be make sure our mission is nimble and that we are working towards every church growing. I don't know, did I just do a political thing and dodge your question?
No, I like it. You used a lovely phrase, John, a new kind of togetherness. I thought that was great. I guess we're all figuring out a new kind of togetherness, aren't we? So step 2 is community audit. I know Penny, who I believe is one of your circuit stewards, is here. Penny, I was wondering if you could tell us what's been the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown on people in your circuit. What's your what's your sense of how people are doing in Durham and Deerness Valley?
Well, these are just some of my observations that I've actually had, as opposed to other people. So they're my view of what they've said or I can see. The people living in our circuit are on the whole in the vulnerable group. So they've been isolated and anxious, but also they found creativity and community care and witness one another, whether they attend church or not. Each chapel's community has found a way of keeping in touch with their members and friends. There are, of course, those who are extremely anxious about catching the virus and are suffering with other issues. And however hard we all try with our technology, we do miss meeting face to face, as those who live alone testify, as they feel forced to eat on their own for several weeks before the slight shifting of lockdown. The families within our folk who have been working from home and homeschooling have not had much of a break over the lockdown, and then there are fears over job losses. We have key workers amongst our group too, and the NHS were clapped enthusiastically on Thursdays. And where possible, the food banks have kept open in our churches to help where they can. And we have at least 2 different camps of people at each end of the worshipping community, and of course others falling in the middle. Those who would rush to get back to what they left, even they know deep down that this isn't going to happen, can't happen. But they still need the security of the familiar, the buildings, the pews, the music. Then we have those who have embraced technology and who will wish to continue with this for some of the time, at least once we are back into our buildings, especially the housebound. With this new way of worshipping, it is possible to access more sermons and prayers than we can probably possibly cope with. But it does mean that everyone has much better access to the gospel. The good news is being shared more widely. We have become a church without walls, and opportunities are opening up for outside prayer labyrinths and graffiti prayer walls and outside services. Those are just some of my views. That keep us going for a bit.
That's great, Penny. Thanks so much. Really interesting that you identified that most of the people in the circuit, or many of them, are in the vulnerable category, and I'm sure that will be true of many Methodist circuits. Thank you. So step 3 in the process is a church review, circuit review. John, is it possible to continue with the review process in the middle of all this uncertainty? I mean, there are lots of unknowns at the moment. What's your view on that?
I think absolutely it's possible to continue with the review process, because that's just what's happening with us. I mean, there's no other way to be for us right now. The situation keeps changing. So if you were to reassess what the community's like, it might be different next week, you know, and it has been different all the way through. Certainly on my street, I didn't know my neighbors as well as I should, you know, and people were coming out to help the other who didn't even know their name before the lockdown. We're passing by people at a distance while we're walking, but we might be walking at similar times, getting our hours exercise, and meeting people who are all vulnerable and anxious and trying to offer love and care in new ways. So the experience of being in lockdown has created a demand for us to continually audit our surroundings. I think that what we've done in circuit is we've recognized that we needed to set some priorities so that we could come out of this safely. And we're in the process of defining what that is. But the CLT gathered together regularly to make firm proposals about what those priorities would look like, and to identify the way in which we're going to implement them. But that's going to be carried by each grouping within our circuit of leaders as they come together to support one another. But what's going to be interesting is, as soon as those groupings are together, we're going to be challenging each other to continue to dream and imagine what the next phase can be like. And it's as though the review process will be a continual thing. It's just not going to happen in quite the same structure that we originally anticipated. And we're missing all the good food and the fun that was going to happen on the weekend that we planned in March, which I imagine maybe one day we'll be able to get back to, but we're not rushing into that.
Very wise, yeah. But it's tough, isn't it? That kind of togetherness is not something we can have at the moment. But as you say, hopefully in the future. And really encouraging to hear that your circuit is still determined to keep going with this review process, even in all this uncertainty. So step 4, dream together. Ruth, you're a deacon in the Durham and Deerness Valley circuit. Are people ready to dream in Durham and Deerness? Do you have dreamers on the circuit team?
I think we do have dreamers, and not maybe some on the circuit team, but also generally in some of our churches. And the different ways and creative ways in which people have found to come together has allowed people to have that voice. And I'm aware that a number of people have taken the space, and we were encouraged to do this at the start of lockdown, to kind of consider the idea of a church on sabbatical, and take some space to sit back and think of ourselves and our church communities, our own personal relationships with God. And it's actually opened up a space that allows us to dream in a different way. Many of the things that we as church folk are good at running around doing, and we say we can't do new things and we can't stop and think because we're too busy, have just stopped by the nature of the situation we find ourselves in. And that's kind of opened up a possibility. I mean, within the dreamers, there are those that dream of getting back to the security of what was before. There are those that dream of new and different things, and we have everyone in between. But I certainly think some of the ways in which we've interacted, both through technology and through doing more things with phone calls for those who don't have access to the internet and other technology, have allowed us to have a depth of conversation that we might not necessarily have had the time to do. And particularly in the early days of lockdown, I and other ministers certainly found ourselves having deeper conversations and individual conversations where things came to the surface. And I think it's provided that opportunity for those who wouldn't necessarily identify themselves as dreamers, have actually been articulating dreams and ideas and thoughts in a way that we wouldn't have been able to hear otherwise. We've just found a different way of doing things. This is the situation we're in, and it just provides different possibilities. Maybe not better or worse possibilities, just simply different ones. And it's being able to recognise those and enable those voices and those dreams to be heard and brought to the wider community. So yes, people are always ready to dream, I feel.
That's brilliant to hear. Thank you, Ruth. And so interesting that in some ways lockdown has opened a space for dreaming for some people. So much. Penny, I'm going to come back to you now, if that's okay. Step 5 is about priorities. I wonder, what difference would it make to have a set of priorities in your circuit?
Well, I think it would be really important and really good if we could. I think most of us prefer to have an end goal to work towards. So with a set of priorities, we'd be able to follow these, and at least, or attempt to follow them anyway, and they would guide us and help us to accomplish the desired end result. And they'll give everyone a sense of purpose and hopefully provide the unity in community.
Fantastic, thank you. It can be quite difficult, I think, identifying priorities, but as you say, how helpful, how kind of enabling it could be to actually to identify those so that everyone knows where they're going. I mean, one of my reflections is, this is really just a guess, but I think possibly will turn out to be true. I think most churches, if not all churches, and not just Methodist churches, are going to have less money, less time available because, you know, volunteers won't want to come out and so on. So we're all having to make do with less. And how much more important then that we choose priorities and we choose where we're going to put our energy, because we haven't got as much as we had before. I wonder, Penny, John, Ruth, anyone who would like to chip in, what's the appetite for action in Durham and Deerness Valley? So step 6 is take action. Are people ready for action?
I think we have the full broad spectrum from feast to fast, if we're honest. And in a sense, that's a natural reaction, both to the situation we find ourselves in now, but also something that was there before we'd even heard of coronavirus, is that different people have different appetites. My sense is that people often want action, they want things to change. John spoke before about the fact that circuits have done back through history many reviews and then find that nothing's happened, nothing comes of them, the action doesn't come into place. And in that sense, people want something to happen, want something different, want the review to make a difference. But it does sit alongside that nervousness, that fear, or that learning from the past that, well, you know, it's not going to happen, it's not going to work because it hasn't in the past. And I think you're dealing with those tensions, and I think it's more a fear of not knowing quite what that action should be rather than a lack of appetite for it. It's kind of like, I have an illustration I use. I like to ask people if they like mangosteen, and I do this knowing full well that the vast majority of people listening have no idea what a mangosteen is, and I think we have some of that here. The mangosteen is a fruit that I enjoyed very much when I lived in the Philippines. And you can't describe what it tastes like because it tastes like a mangosteen. So it's kind of that, are we going to try and see? Are we going to taste and see? And I think a big part of the review and involving people in the process is giving them, in a sense, the courage and the encouragement and the enablement to actually take part. I think people want the action. They're just not sure how to make it come about or how to kind of let go and take that step of faith.
That's great. That's great. I love the mangosteen illustration. I'll have to remember that one.
I'll send you one sometime.
Oh, awesome. John, did you have a hand up?
Well, I did. Only to say that we, you know, the actions it's going to happen in stages. And we had originally defined an understanding of what our action plan might look like coming out of a review process. And it still may evolve into this because kind of interestingly, God's hand is in on a lot of things and is sort of offering new stuff that falls in line with some of our original thoughts, despite the fact we might not be able to implement them all right away. But the Methodist way of life is becoming a big thing to focus on in our district. And essentially, it's broken down into our all calling principles. And inside of it, it offers we will statements. To create an action plan, all we have to do is add the word by, and define what it is that we're going to be doing. And so we have decided as a circuit, or at least as a circuit leadership team, to agree to certain principles for what coming back might look like. It requires a new way of working together, and it'll enable the leaders from the different groupings of churches that wouldn't be able to imagine on their own how to do things. Hopefully together we'll be able to function in a more proficient way that's able to react to whatever changes are coming in the coming weeks. We know that we have the potential to come back and try to get to an earlier way of being that's not going to be realistic. So we've accepted, I think, as a principle that what we find is going to be the best expression for God and the Spirit that speaks to the condition we find ourselves in week to week. And we have good leaders like Penny who are helping us think that through. And Helle, in particular, as our mission enabler, asked some really pertinent questions about, what would you put on a blank sheet of paper if you were going to build the best way forward? And we're going to embrace that. We're not worried about the fact that we don't have the full action plan populated, because we know how to populate it. We know that we have our calling to hold on to as an umbrella, and it gives us a good focus for the way to be church. And we know the Methodist way of life is pointing us towards statements of what we are and our identity and what we will be doing. And all we have to figure out is the buys as the opportunities arrive. And this group will continue to help us to ask the questions to populate those fields in action plans for the future. But it's going to be flexible. It's going to keep moving. And it's only because there's a great people gathering together, putting their minds together, despite me. And my, I don't trust a fruit that's going to taste like mango and langoustine combined. I don't believe
nothing like that.
I don't believe enough. And in the circuit, I don't believe enough with our leaders. I try to take a step back and accept that they've got good things to push us towards. I want to mention one last thing, and that's that early in our process, we had a lady in Durham who just showed up, who wanted to remind us in our calling that sometimes when we're talking about mission planning, we overlook the importance of pastoral care, and that pastoral work needs to be in our mission planning too. Her name is Allison Moore, and she's been writing here out of Durham University. Brilliant lady who helped us to try to create questions in a review that would help complement each section of our calling, but that pastoral drive is an important part of our ethos too. And we are trying to be nimble to meet the people's needs as we discover what they are.
That's great. That's great. And I've certainly stolen a little bit of Alison's insights for the mission planning workbook that I'll be talking about a bit later on. So really, really helpful input into the whole process. Ruth, step 7 is about fruitfulness, and this is quite a new way of thinking in some ways in churches. We're quite good at churches at figuring out what we want to do, but thinking about fruitfulness, what would it look like if this is fruitful? That's perhaps less familiar. I mean, do you think this is a helpful way of thinking? How receptive do you think people might be to it?
Again, it's that whole mix. I mean, one of the things we've identified in Circuit is key is communication. And I think helping people to understand what fruitfulness might be and what that might look like and how that can be something of what people want. I think very often the language we use is around criteria and ticking boxes and achieving things. And I know we have lots of analogies in the Bible for what the kingdom of God looks like. But in terms of the world's view of how we mark things as success and how we describe them as a criteria, it's not the way the kingdom is. So having that different way of looking at things, I think, is particularly helpful, because you can identify the ways in which kingdom growth and kingdom values might be seen that perhaps doesn't come out in some of the more formal structures we use. It is perhaps an unfamiliar way of thinking, but I think once people experience it, it's also a helpful way, because they can identify it and see what's happened. And in terms of fruitfulness, I always kind of imagined that fruitfulness is an ongoing thing. It's not something that happens once. For those of us who are gardeners, we don't grow raspberries or apple trees and then they're cut down and they're finished. It's an ongoing process that continually involves development and change and pruning and feeding. And I think it helps to get people into that mindset. I was talking in a conversation yesterday about setting, targets and things to do. And so often we set ourselves up to fail. But fruitfulness is an ongoing process. And therefore we can have that language where we look at where we've got to and see what God is doing through that. And then think, well, what's the next step? And there's always that ongoing process, and enabling people to look back. And I think the language of fruitfulness, because it's not a set of we're going to do this and achieve this, it allows individual churches to have their own perhaps priorities and what they see as the development in their particular community that can help them to give a local response to what's happening in their church, in their community, in the place that they are. I think unfamiliar things are helpful because often the familiar we stop thinking about.
That's so helpful. Thank you, Ruth. Thanks to everyone in the panel for your reflections so far. We're going to move into breakout rooms now. Those of you who are listening carefully will realise we've just skipped over step 8, which was decide when you're going to review again. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. We're going to come back to Durham and Deerness Valley later on in the webinar and talk about their plans for action. And I'll ask John about review plans then. So it's time to sort everyone into breakout rooms. You're going to be in groups of 6 or 7 people. And what we'd ask is for you to consider that 8-step process. And I'll broadcast the process into your breakout rooms in case you've forgotten it. And the question is just simply, what could this process do for your church or your circuit? And what do you think might be the difficulties? What could this process do for your church or circuit? And what do you think the difficulties might be? And panel, you're very welcome to go into breakout rooms if you'd like to, or you can take a break with me and stay in the main session. Just to reassure people, breakout rooms are not recorded, so you're free to say whatever you like. When you get into a breakout room, do unmute yourselves in gallery view and you'll have the best experience. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had some fruitful conversations in breakout rooms. You'd be very welcome to put your feedback in chat. So the question was, what is helpful in this 8-point process? What do you think might be the difficulties in using this in your church or in your circuit? So do pop your feedback in chat, and I'm going to ask the panel to comment. So we've got Penny, John and Ruth on our panel, who are all from the Durham and Deerness Valley circuit. We've got Helle Sewell, who is the mission enabler for Darlington, and we've got Fiona Fidgin, who we all call Fidge, who is the learning network officer for this part of Darlington. So it's for the northeast team, but she's the officer assigned to this part of the district. So what have you been saying in your breakout rooms? I've already noted some really helpful questions that I've put down for at the end. We're going to do Q&A in about 15 minutes time, so thanks for the questions that have already been posted. Sally says sometimes it's hard getting people to dream. Anyone in the panel, if you'd like to comment on any of these, feel free to unmute yourselves. My kind of instinct was that might be tricky, that some people I guess naturally are dreamers and a lot of people aren't. Although Ruth, I know you were quite optimistic about the dreaming that was going on in your circuit, which is great. Glenn says the Methodist way of life is a great resource. Love the idea of using the commitments. Connection will be sending us out more resources. Okay. I mean, Methodist way of life, yeah, fantastic, completely agree. Sam says helpful to do the community audit, as it can help focus the mission of the church to focus on the need of the community. Fidge, are you involved in helping people with community audits? Is that something you do as part of your role in the Learning Network?
No,
No.
but it is something that I have done previously.
Yeah.
And I think there can be some problems about doing that. I think it's, you know, we say do a community audit, and I think it's probably the sort of thing that everybody goes, oh, we don't really quite know how to do that. So I don't know if it's a bit more helpful for folks to think about what resources and tools that might actually mean, and how we physically do that, I think, is one of the queries.
Yeah, so a bit more help, bit more support with that. Yeah. Nita says dreamers need people to listen to them. Yeah, that's very interesting. You sometimes find, don't you, there are, in any community of people, whether in the church or out, you have some who will come up with ideas and spend their lives dreaming, and they do need to be listened to. Obviously dreams need to be sifted, but we do need to be open to that dreaming. Jean says the process seems long. I can imagine it rumbling on in the background for ages. Yeah, interesting. I mean, John, I know you've been taking time over this process. Has it become longer now, John, than you were planning it to be because of the lockdown? Or were you always planning to spend several months on this process?
Well, I think, I mean, I guess I probably had hopes that we would have an event over the weekend, that event would produce a certain amount of information that I could put into a nice, neat little action plan with boxes and timelines, and then I could hold us all accountable, myself included, to getting things done. The process is taking a lot longer, but that's because the event didn't happen.
Yeah.
What did happen was a shift. There was a major shift, and the events almost, actually helped us. It helped us to realize the event was, we already had a lot of the information that we needed to begin making progress. We'd harvested it by asking questions similar to the review questions in previous meetings. We had a great report that came from the fruit of this process, and to begin to ask the questions about the community. All that was giving us a lot of information to put together. But maybe what we're saying is that instead, especially in this complex time, coming out of a really strange experience of lockdown, whenever that opportunity arrives, engaging with whatever the future is going to throw at us, we see that it's maybe less event-based, the community review. It's less sort of staged in sequential events, and more of that the process, the 8 steps, are all important to embed into our culture, so that we're asking the right questions at the right time and developing actions that are going to respond to the needs. And I think we've seen, by doing this work for the last year, that the culture is changing in our circuit. And the culture is one where review becomes a part of our natural way of being. And that's really helpful when you're coming to an uncertain time in the future about what we need to do next.
Great, thank you, John. Loads more feedback appearing in the chat. Thanks, everybody. A couple of straightforward questions that I can speak into, if that's okay. So there's a question about how this 8-point process relates to our church's future story. They're going to be a set of resources that will be live from the 1st of August, so a couple of weeks' time. And these have been prepared now that God for All, the Connectional Evangelism and Growth Strategy, has been adopted by conference. The Evangelism and Growth team have been putting together a set of web resources. So from the 1st of August, there's going to be a rewritten mission planning toolkit, which will be structured around this 8-point process, but will direct people to, for example, our church's future story. And so I would say that our church's future story is particularly good at helping with steps 3 and 4 in this process, helping churches and circuits to review their activities and encouraging people to dream. So yeah, great resource there. Thanks for mentioning it. Someone else, apologies, I didn't catch your name, but someone else wrote, is it right that we're expected to write a mission plan before we reopen our buildings? Certainly that was the advice given in the connectional guidance. Now, as the connectional team, we're here to support the Methodist Church. We're not here to tell you what to do. It's down to individual churches and circuits to make that call. But the Methodist Church is encouraging every church to have a mission plan or end-of-life plan. regardless. And I believe personally, and our team feels strongly, that coming out of lockdown, mission planning is going to be even more helpful than ever. That really, when we're making decisions about reopening for worship, we need to be making these decisions in the wider context of our mission. So thank you so much, everybody, for that feedback, and we'll have some time to come back to more of your reflections and questions a little bit later on. But I'd like to come back to the circuit team now to talk about your plans for the future, and Helle and Fidge to talk about your involvement. So Helle, do you want to just say hi so that we can see your face on screen? You unmute yourself.
Yes, hi everyone. Yeah, thanks Emma. I mean, I came to this specific process kind of when they already had started. But when I started my job as a mission enabler, I started a similar process with 2 other circuits. So what I would like to say kind of from my point of view is that the circuit review can be tailored really to the way that the circuit itself is either put together or behaves, or, you know, every circuit has their character really. And one of the things I would kind of want to add to this is as well that there needs to be, I guess my role has been the mediator sometimes in going in, because you can have quite a difficult group of, let's say, circuit leadership team perhaps, who just don't really communicate with one another very well. So actually, first of all, arriving to the place where people can freely talk about, you know, accepting what has happened and what the reality is, and then able to talk about what we can do next, can be a really difficult starting point. And it can make people fearful in going into these circuit reviews, because there's going to be so many different personalities and points of views that come together. So in 2 other places, I've been able to kind of help them being the mediator. So I've done a lot of listening. And then based on what I hear, having the bigger picture in mind, I've been able to ask them these difficult questions, but they've been able to respond to me, but actually they're responding to everybody. Do you see what I'm getting at? So it's almost having, you know, somebody in place who's enabling that difficult conversations to have, and actually people being honest. Honesty is something that we don't seem to do very well, or accepting the reality is something we don't seem to be doing well. So I think in these processes, sometimes perhaps it's important to have somebody from the outside, or somebody who's very good at mediating, or somebody who's very good at listening in what's happening during the process.
That's great, and it sounds like you've been a real asset to many circuits in your district there. Sometimes the district missioner community find that people don't know that they're there. So one of the things we want to do in this webinar is just to alert people to the fact that I believe 18 out of the 30 districts have a mission enabler. They will have slightly different job titles. So I believe your mission and community engagement enabler, I think that's your full job title, yeah. We have an intergenerational mission enabler in the Southampton district, an evangelism enabler in Plymouth and Exeter, but many districts do have mission enablers on their team. So if you as a circuit or as a church are struggling with mission planning, or just wanting some extra help, facilitation, Helle talked about being someone to listen and to kind of mediate in these processes. You know, talk to your district team, find out if there's someone there who can offer you some time. And I might cheekily say, if you don't have a mission enabler, maybe ask your district to haven't got one, and perhaps consider appointing one.
Yeah. And also Learning Network is absolutely wonderful. I mean, you know, they can equally come and support and help and suggest, you know, these things as well. In Darlington District, we work very closely with Learning Network. So we are very fortunate that we have a very great relationship with one another.
That's great. So we also have Fidge here from the Learning Network. Welcome, Fidge. Just tell us a little bit more about the Learning Network too, and because again, not all circuits will necessarily be aware that they have Learning Network officers who have, you know, huge experience and abilities as facilitators. Tell us a bit more about your role.
Well, I don't really want to say. I hope people here don't know that they have a learning development officer or a learning network team in their region. I'd be mortified if that is the case. And if that is the case, then go and look them up on the website, I think is what I'd say straight away. Every region in the connection has a learning network team, and there's always some folks on the learning network team who have the responsibility of doing church and circuit reviews. So there are a few of us around the connection who have quite a lot of experience of doing this. And part, of course, of the learning process is that it is a process, and it's a reflective process. One of the things that we are picking up in Durham and Deerness Valley is that folks have said, oh, they did this before. And the kind of like lack of energy about doing it again. And they're kind of like, oh, we did this before and nothing happened. And I think there is something about the fact that, you know, change isn't something that just happens overnight. It's a bit of a process, and it's a reflective process. And part of where we're in now in this kind of time that we find ourselves in is that we're not really sure what the future is going to look like, or indeed what our church buildings will look like, or indeed what church is looking like. But we do want to be reliant upon the Holy Spirit to listen to that process, to listen to what people are saying to us, to listen to kind of discerning what's happening in the digital world as much as what's happening in the physical world. And, you know, this process will change us. Every one of us here is in a process of change. And in our circuit review, we are in a process of change. And, you know, we need to pay attention and listen to that. So there's something about a learning cycle, I think. You know, we said very much in the circuit review that we didn't want to just come in and say, so we're going to do this circuit review and then this is going to be a change, and then bam, 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 that'll be done. You know, we want to kind of like look at it again in 2 or 3 years' time, look at it again in 6 years' time, and kind of be continually discerning. What is it we need to look at now? What is the process now? In our district, we have a vision in the Darlington District, a vision of every church growing. And if that's going to be the case, then we need to be continually looking and thinking about what does that look like? What do we need to be doing so that every church is growing? And of course, we do that in our current context. You know, none of us expected to be here on Zoom sort of February having this kind of conversation, and here we all are. And who knows what next year's context might be like. So there are folks in your learning network who are familiar with doing church and circuit reviews. So please do get in touch with them under the kind of learning network pages on the Methodist Church website.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fidge. Do make sure, folks, that you take advantage of the gifts of your learning network and your district mission enabler if you have one, because these folks can provide so much extra support and facilitation and mediation in these in writing a mission plan and putting it into practice. So if we go back now to the circuit team, to John, Penny and Ruth, I'd love to know what it is that you plan to do next. So tell us about your action plan.
Yeah, so we have our circuit meeting scheduled next week that's going to explore the proposal made by the circuit leadership team of reforming our circuit into new groupings. We have been 15 churches where we've recognized that over the decades, really, we've been in systemic decline, that jobs are falling, increasing numbers of jobs are falling on fewer and fewer shoulders. So we are going to try to pool together our resources. And by resources, I'm not as worried about the money, because it doesn't matter how much is in the bank. It matters, you know, kind of if you can afford the things you want to be able to do. But I'm really worried about the people. And many of us are feeling vulnerable now. And I can't predict what they're going to want to do coming out of lockdown, but I can bring them together to have the conversation. So the circuit meeting is trying to set together deliberate groupings of churches to support one another and to share its human resources and to try to function as one church on different sites potentially. We're going to approach any new mission objective with an open mind and an open heart, praying that the Spirit is guiding us in good directions. And we're treating the future church as a blank page, and we're going to add to our work and our ministries those things which we believe God is saying to us we should be doing next, and we should be prioritizing and deserve our energies. and will help us to become the first circuit in our district where every church is growing. I want to be the first mainly because I want to show Helle that all these other churches she's working with, not nearly as important as our circuit. So.
Okay, there's the challenge for you. John, you mentioned that the Methodist way of life was something you've been thinking about, and you see that as important in your action plan. Can you say a bit more about that? Because some folks in chat have been referring to the Methodist way of life.
Yeah, well, I mean, we think it's a great initiative coming, primarily out of Yorkshire, and the conference seems to be adopting it as a really helpful tool. It follows along our callings guidelines and principles, which helps us to have a framework for the mission statement that the broader church has pointed us in. And when we were going about a review process, we were going to follow our calling as a structure and a framework. The Methodist way of life gives statements about identity, and they help us to tell our story again. And in it, it says, we will pray, we will do different things that help us to resonate as a Methodist people. And our actions, I hope, will be able to be just the clause that follows it, by. We will make sure we all pray by, giving people opportunities to come together, to give people good resources, which we have been doing as a district and in our circuit in lockdown, to help people to pray. So, whatever the clauses that follows by in the Methodist way of life will be our action plan.
That's great. And if folks listening are not familiar with the details of the Methodist way of life, we actually had a webinar a few weeks ago. So if you go to methodist.org.uk/mission beyond lockdown, which is the page where you probably registered for this webinar, you'll find some tiles to click on where you can find recordings of previous webinars. And if you look in June, you'll find the Methodist way of life introduced by Roger Walton along with various colleagues. So do check that out. A fantastic, not just a resource would be the wrong word, a kind of a movement project, really potentially really fruitful and powerful in terms of what it means to be Methodist and Methodist mission. You also have a district mission plan, which this is very much part of. So John, am I right in thinking that every church growing is kind of key in your district mission plan, and that's something you're reflecting in the circuit plan?
I think it's what we're hanging our hat on. We're trying to figure out with our decisions, are they going to be, growing doesn't necessarily mean in numbers, so I think it's very important to deal with numeric problems with numeric solutions. Doesn't necessarily mean in numbers. There are factors that were defined in a study by a fellow named Orton, who looked at churches in the Northeast that were growing. And they said there were a number of factors to growing. Having a good system of exploration of discipleship is among them. And we have to be looking at all of the different things that help us to grow both inwardly and outwardly, and try to model something that gives us assurance that we can report back. Yeah, we are a circuit where every church is growing. It might be in a variety of ways. I hope numerically too.
That's great. Now, interesting that that you say that, John, because we've had some fascinating comments come through on the chat that particularly relate to this. So Glenn asks, how can every church be a growing church in the context of COVID, when everything's kind of been thrown up in the air? People, financial resources. Paul says, in terms of growth, numbers through the door isn't the only or the best way to measure the impact of the church on its community. So two really important points there. And again, either John or Ruth or Penny, anyone in the team, Fidge, Helle, do feel free to comment. Perhaps firstly on this first point of how can every church be growing in this post-COVID situation? What would you say to that?
I kind of just want to expand on the idea of fruitfulness, and I think it's why we brought the language in to the review process of fruitfulness rather than growth, because growth does provoke in people's minds that thought of bums on seats, of numerical growth. For those who aren't gardeners, and I'm not an expert by any means, I mean, fruitfulness is an ongoing process. It's something that goes on year by year. I kind of said in the breakout room. We don't grow an apple tree, take the fruit off one year and then chop it down and throw it all away. We keep going with it. I mean, the hope is that the language, and language is key to this, in finding ways that help people to express what we're doing and don't narrow down their perspective and their view to what they assume, and narrow expectations to that. No, growth is not just about numbers. It's about growth in depth of spirituality, in individual journeys, in how we work together as a community, and how we work together connectionally. We're a connectional church, that all those things matter. And in looking at the fruit and in reviewing where we're at, you can be more mindful of that and more aware of that, rather than some of the much more physical, tangible things that we tend to associate. I mean, the nature of the kingdom is that many of the things we do, many of the things that we aspire to, many of the things that we believe God is calling us to, are not measurable, physical, tangible things in the way the world understands. And it's kind of having that conversation and helping people to expand their understanding, perhaps, of what growth is, what fruitfulness is, that will help them. And I think in that sense, I don't think the church isn't growing. I know it's a massive cliche. God is not in lockdown, and neither is the kingdom. And we're just growing in different ways and with different opportunities. And it's being able to seize that. I mean, there's a phrase, seize the day. I'm quite realistic. I like the phrase grasp the nettle, because boy, sometimes does it come with a bit of pain and irritation and other things, but it is still something that we can do, even in the midst of lockdown. And I'm kind of conscious that this review process was begun before lockdown, and we're taking account necessarily of the current situation, and we're mindful of how things might develop into the future. And I know one on our group doesn't like the term coming out of lockdown, with the understanding we probably aren't going to for a very, very long time. But it's not just about that. It goes way back beyond any mention of coronavirus, and we'll go into the future way beyond that. And it's not just about coronavirus and what happens in the next few months. This is kingdom building for the long term.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ruth. And while you were explaining that so helpfully, I was remembering the Darlington mission plan. I think I'm right in saying it's titled Every Church Growing, but the ambition is at the end of 10 years. Is that, have I remembered that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're not talking about every church growing by next week. I'm talking about church buildings on Sunday mornings bursting at the seams.
No.
About growth.
I mean, sorry, yeah, there's something to be said about process. You know, I don't know, in Methodism, we're kind of used to throwing out programs. Here, do this, you will have church growth. Do this, you know, you will have people come in the church. And I think we need to shift away from programs to process. And that's why Methodist way of life is a way of life that is a process. It's a process that enables ourselves to grow spiritually. And, you know, our spiritual lives then reflect our actions. And when we serve others, let's say through a food bank, then what we say, you know, is meaningful to others because our life is rooted in Christ. And, you know, when we talk about process, then others will see what we have is that what they want as well. So, you know, and if we provide opportunities where we can gather together, where we also do theology, learn, grow, pray together, and so on, and not necessarily on a Sunday as a church, but any other time of the week that's convenient, you know, then at the end, the process is constantly evolving and it's moving. And at the end, you know, I know we like numbers and we want to measure, and we can say, you know, we can't probably say by the end of 10 years we're going to have this number of people come to church, but we are able to measure the process and see the growth in people and see where they are from now to in 10 years' time.
Thank you, Helle. We've got quite a few questions come through, so if it's okay, I'm just going to move us on. Elaine asks the panel, do you have any local churches who are not engaging with this process, particularly with regard to managing trustees insisting on opening buildings in a way that's out of sync with the overall circuit strategy? Is that obviously only say what you're happy to say publicly, but is that been an issue?
I'm doing a dance with one or two churches, but so far we're still dancing. We haven't fallen out.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So Paul says, is there a generational aspect at play? And Paul and Sally both have asked actually. Is there a generational aspect in terms of people who want things not to change versus people who want to see change and growth? Is it about the age of church members, or is it actually a much more nuanced picture than that? Ruth's shaking her head.
I don't think it is. The perception is that it's age related, but it's not. No, it's far more nuanced than that.
Yeah. Sally,
I would say it's definitely not in our circuit. We have some really progressive people from many different age categories. Our youth group, if we were to form it, might start with people in their 60s, but there are people with minds that are so brilliant and progressive and forward-thinking through every decade. We're very lucky.
Interesting. So Sally asked about the transitional community of students in Durham, obviously a university town. Do any of your churches have students in their congregations? I wonder where students fit into this whole review process.
We do have students, and as I said before, one of our students, wrote this, wrote this musical for us with based on Wesley's tunes with new words. They've helped. We had a student worker through the one project pushing us last year, and involved in our meetings and choosing to be involved in our meetings going forward as well, which is great, helping us to think about better ways of communication. So yeah, students do play a factor, but we don't have the same engagement with the student population as some of the other churches in the area. We won an award for being the most welcoming church by the Student Christian Movement, the most welcoming church in the country. But when we received the award, I had to look at the numbers of students coming compared to the numbers of students coming to the other churches, and thinking, this is something we're very thankful for and proud of, and we're grateful to be welcoming, but we might not be engaging as well as we should.
Thank you so much. Just one last question to put to the panel. Paul says the main problem that he's seen is that meetings often focus on the day-to-day business of the church and don't give enough time to talking about mission. Sharon says mission is not an item on the agenda, it is the agenda. I mean, clearly this is you as a circuit, Helle as mission enabler, and Fidge as learning network officer. Clearly you are passionate about mission, and that shines out from everything you said today. What would you say to people in churches where they're struggling with that, with the agendas of meetings, just focusing on the day-to-day and not thinking about the bigger picture?
One of the things we've intentionally done in the circuit, and it's been put into place in a number of our churches and at circuit meetings and others, is to actually reformat our agenda. And it's something that's available. I'm quite happy to let people have it. Is we actually work through our calling and look at what the work of God is in terms of the 4 areas of our calling, and then also to then look at the governance issues beyond that, so that the governance is addressing the issues you've just raised in talking through our calling. And that's simple switching around of your agenda. And we've kind of talked about illustrating our calling and governance and things in, rather than as a list, as a cruciform that explains how that is, and how the governance and the administration and the finance, and recognising their place, but how they kind of underpin it and enable it rather than guide it and dictate it. So if people want some more information on that, it does make a difference when you talk about what we're called to and then the governance than it does doing the other way around. It's quite a simple thing to do, but I'm quite happy to let people have, as I said, that format of agenda, which I got from somebody else, so I'm quite happy to give it away.
Well, I'd definitely like to see that, Ruth, and I'm sure there's many people listening who would like to. So if you're happy to send that on to me, it's something that I can upload along with the recording of this webinar. Interesting that the last workshop that I led shortly before lockdown hit was at a Birmingham Mission Day, and I talked about agendas for meetings and how we might structure them. And I love your idea of structuring your agenda around our calling. Makes a load of sense. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Would anyone from the panel like to say, have any last comments that they'd like to make before we draw to a close?
I'd love to say very briefly that we recognized, I think, throughout this process of discussing how to do a successful circuit review and how to offer that widely to the district, that there are barriers, systemic barriers to growth, systemic barriers to engaging in valid and rich community mission, but they don't have to be. And one of the things the lockdown is giving us is a really good excuse to reassess and change the way we do things. And I think togetherness is going to drive us towards growth. And even if it's just for a moment, and it's not true in 10 years' time, if we do reduce from 15 churches to 4 churches, but working on 15 sites, those 4 churches are numerically going to be a lot bigger than the 15 we're separately. So we are going to win, just in case anybody was wondering, the growth competition. And we're down to 8.5 years. We don't have 10 years left. We've got a clock ticking away. So getting rid of the barriers, why not do it as soon as possible?
And I would want to say also that actively, there's so much culture, I think, that we have in our churches, the way we do things. Unfortunately, we would have to actively work with changing that culture and persist with it. There are so many people out there who have some great ways of working and changing things. And A, we need to start listening to them, but B, we need to support them, and C, we need to start actively changing the culture that doesn't work for us anymore.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thanks to the Durham and Deerness Valley Circuit. Thanks to Helle and to Fidge. It's been a really interesting conversation this afternoon. Thanks to all of you who've posted comments and questions, and apologies that we haven't been able to get to all of them, but it's been really encouraging to see your engagement with this conversation. As I mentioned, we are going to be posting the recording of this webinar, and I'm hoping to post Ruth's pattern for a meeting agenda there as well. And I noted in the chat that there are others who've used this, who have used a similar idea, and it sounds absolutely fantastic. This is the last of the Mission Beyond Lockdown webinars. We're soon going to be in the official start of the school holidays, although I appreciate that school holidays means something a little bit different now. And we recognise that lots of people will be trying to take some time out, even if not some holiday. So during August, there won't be any webinars, but this is not the end. So do look at the evangelism and growth pages for details of future webinars. We'd love to continue having these reflective conversations that spur each other on to action. As I mentioned before, there's going to be a whole new set of evangelism and growth web pages that will go live in 2 weeks' time on the 1st of August. I've written some pages on mission planning, which includes a rewritten mission planning toolkit, which will go through and explain the 8-point process that we shared today and point to resources to help you. There'll be a mission planning workbook, which will be a free download for churches and circuits to use. I'd love it if you would check out and access those resources when they go live. So thank you, everybody. It's been a great conversation. I'd love it if the panel would just stay behind for a few minutes just for me to thank you. But for now, goodbye and have a great afternoon.